Hey, geography, how are you guys doing today? I hope that it is a good day for you. I hope that you're doing well with this whole thing, with all the many weeks we've been doing online. It's hard to believe, and won't be that much longer. We're going to be done with the month of April. And then May is the last month. We graduate. The year ends in May. So some of you actually in the class are graduating, but a lot of you will just be going up to the 10th grade. But either way, the year is going to be over here pretty soon. So just keep on keeping on during this crazy pandemic. We've talked about Western Europe. This is our third week on it. We're going to be finishing it today, and we'll be having a test this week over the whole of Western Europe. We talked about the UK and Scandinavia, and then we talked about continental Europe. Now we're talking about Mediterranean Europe. So what we're going to do is we're going to locate the countries and major cities of Mediterranean Europe, and then briefly, and I'll explain why, we're going to compare and contrast Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy at the end of the lesson. You'll see why. And you should have already read chapter 11, the one we're talking through right now, but if you haven't, make sure you have it read before the test. Like I've said before, those of you who do well and get A's on the test, or those who read and watch the lectures, if you're not A, reading, or B, watching the lectures, or C, both, then you're probably getting a low C if you're really lucky, but probably a D or an F. So make sure that you guys are doing this and keeping up with the reading. So in our exploration of Mediterranean Europe, as a quick reminder, we talked about the UK, right, the United Kingdom over here, and Ireland, and then we talked about Scandinavia, which is kind of cut off in this map, obviously. Then last week we talked about continental Europe, right, in this area right here. So this is continental Europe. This is all Eastern Europe over here, but we're going to be talking about that next week. But for this week, we're going to be talking about Mediterranean Europe. And so you can see the Mediterranean Sea right here, right? It's the sea that goes between Africa and Europe. And this is the Mediterranean Sea, and you have three peninsulas that essentially are Mediterranean Europe. You have the Iberian Peninsula right here, you have the Italian Peninsula, and you have the Balkans. So these three peninsulas are what we're going to be talking about today, and of course the countries in each one. And by the way, I don't have time in these slides. I could sit and give you every fact and every geographic feature of every nation, but I don't really think it's worth it. I mean, it's no different than you just reading the book. I'm just giving you guys an overview of these lectures. There's a few points I want to hit on that are important, but really when it comes to the details, I can't do these countries justice in a lecture like this. So as you read through the book, hopefully you can catch a lot of the details and landmarks. Well, anyways, let's start with the Iberian Peninsula. So it's this peninsula right here. Spain is what we'll start with right here. Spain is the largest country on the peninsula. Over 80% of the peninsula is Spain. And if you want to go back a few centuries, you had Ferdinand and Isabel. They were the respective rulers of Castile and Aragon. There are these two basically states, and then they came together to form Spain. And it was not too long later so we're talking about like 15th century right now. It wasn't too long later that Columbus approached them. In 1492, he sailed the ocean blue, and that was recently after Spain had become what it is today as a nation. So Spain right here, the capital is Madrid. You can see Madrid here on the map. The Tagus River is the longest river, and it flows south of Madrid. And then you have the Strait of Gibraltar, and there's this little gap right here. This is the Strait of Gibraltar. It's an 8-mile gap between Spain and Africa. So it's not too far, and you can be on another continent. It's kind of cool. There's also the Rock of Gibraltar is in that area too, and there's been a lot of fighting over that as well. But again, there's a lot you could study there. Studying the British holdings of it, that's kind of interesting too. But for now, though, that's the basics of Spain. Now let's move on to another one. You have Andorra here. Andorra is really tiny. I don't know if you can see. It's labeled here on the map, but it almost is like a city. But like, Andorra is a very small territory between Spain and France. It's high up in the Pyrenees Mountains. And the legend has it, against a legend, but that Charlemagne, if you go back to 800 AD, Charlemagne was the one who was ultimately crowned the Holy Roman Emperor, by the Pope. Anyways, but supposedly Charlemagne gave this small group of people independence and freedom because they helped fight the Moors, which is another way for saying Muslims, because the Muslims at one point had conquered a good chunk of the Iberian Peninsula and had even gotten up to France. And then they got driven out eventually. But this group of people here at Andorra supposedly helped the Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, so he gave them their independence forever. And so that's why they're their own little nation right there. But it's kind of an interesting fact. And then the last nation on the peninsula is Portugal. and the capital is Lisbon. There's about 3.5 million people, so we're talking about a pretty big city. They don't speak Spanish. They speak Portuguese. And you probably remember, we just talked about not too long ago with South America, the reason why Brazil speaks Portuguese is because the line of demarcation and the Treaty of Tordesillas, when ultimately Portugal was given the rights to the land on the eastern side of South America, and Spain was given the rights to the western side. So that's why most of South America speaks Spanish, but Brazil speaks Portuguese. Well, this is Portugal right here. This little nation at one point had a tremendous influence on a lot of the world. Again, I wish we'll talk about this more in world history about the spice trade and everything that happened there. But for now, just so you know, Portugal is on the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, let's move on to another peninsula, the Italian Peninsula. And I always like to mention this. It's funny, I didn't really even notice this till I was, probably not even till high school. I'm just sad because it's such a cool thing to know. Is Italy looks totally like a boot. Look, there's the toe. There's the heel, right? And it's like it's kicking a soccer ball or something. You see that? So the Italian Peninsula is like a boot and kicking a ball or something. So it's the Italian Peninsula. The ancient Romans, they called it Italia, which means grazing land. And they were referring to the southern part of the peninsula where there's arable land good for growing crops. But that's why it's Italy's, because they called it Italia, which means grazing land. The capital is Rome. Over here, and so Rome is a fascinating city. I don't know if any of you have been to Rome, but you have all sorts of landmarks there. You have, of course, the Roman Empire was about 1,000-year powerful ruling institution that at one point controlled all of the land around the Mediterranean. It was all centered here in Italy. There's tons of history there I wish we could go into, but again, next year we'll have a whole chapter on Rome. The Apennine Mountains, they run down Italy, and that's a big part of the peninsula. It's very mountainy, obviously in that area. Then you have the Po River, which is the longest river in Italy. It's up in the northeast, and then the northwest, and it flows into the Adriatic Sea. And then you have Venice, and Venice is interesting. It's up here. Venice was this beautiful city built on over 100 islands. So it's like this city on a bunch of islands. And if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, there's some pretty cool scenes in Venice. So just throw that out there. But that's Italy, and again, Italy's going to take up the peninsula. But there's more than, than just Italy. We also have, again, just like Andorra, we also have some smaller little principalities. Monaco over here, for example, and it's really hard to see. It's on the border here between France and Italy. It's 10 miles away from the border, and it's considered its own thing, but it's this confusing mix where basically a long time ago there were Italians from Genoa captured the area, and their descendants have been ruling ever since. But the people of Monaco have been basically made French. They speak French, their primary trading partner is French. And so basically they're pretty much French culture, French language, French everything, yet they have Italian rulers. So it's this confusing mix. And there was a treaty signed in the early 20th century that said, if the rulers of Monaco, the princes, if they ever failed to produce a male heir, then France could annex it and make it part of their territory if they wanted. But in the meantime, it's just an independent nation. Kind of an interesting merger of French and Italian. You have San Marino as well. Now, in San Marino, never united with Italy, it remains independent to this day. And it's interesting how that works. It's in the Apennine Mountains. And again, we do our best with the history here. Supposedly, there was a Christian group that fled to this area to hide out from the Emperor Diocletian when he was persecuting Christians. We don't know that for sure. But we do know this, that before Italy, when you look at the map, you just see Italy, and it's easy. But for the longest time, Italy was divided between all sorts of territories and many states. And it wasn't until later that they all came together as Italy, but San Marino is one of those that just never wanted to unite with Italy, so it remains its an independent little state. And Mount Titano lies at its heart. So it's in the mountains, and you have a pretty famous mountain at the heart of the principality. Then you have Vatican City, and Vatican City is fascinating because Vatican City is actually its own country, technically, but it's tiny. It's the tiniest country in the world, and it's inside of the city of Rome. So you have Rome as a city, then inside of the city of Rome, you have Vatican City, which is a small area that has complete independence from the world. That's where the Pope lives and the cardinals. That's where the head of the Catholic Church is. But so whenever you hear people talk about the Vatican, it's an area surrounded by Rome that is essentially the smallest country in the world because it's considered not part of Italy, not part of any other nation. But it's kind of a fascinating thing there. And then lastly, you have Malta. And Malta is a tiny island right here. You can't even see it too well. But it's actually, the country of Malta actually contains the island of Malta and an island called Gozo and a few smaller islands around it. I will notice one thing interesting is, this is according to the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked there back around 60 AD when he was going to Rome for trial. That's where they were on the island and the viper bit him, but he didn't die, so everybody realized that he was blessed by God, and supposedly the whole island converted to Christianity. But if you ever read in the book of Acts 27, Malta, that's the island being referred to as south of Sicily right here. I should mention that too, by the way. This is the island of Sicily, and it's part of Italy. There's a lot of cool history about the island, and then you have Sardinia over here, and that's another island. Here is part of the country, Sardinia. Okay, so moving on to the last bit, you have the Balkans Peninsula. Again, we're going to be talking about the bulk of this peninsula in the next section, but for now, let's talk about Greece. Greece has always been considered Western civilization. It's part of the bedrock of Western civilization, the laws, Plato and Aristotle, the philosophy. Greece is a huge foundation of the West, so we're going to classify it as Western Europe. The capital of Greece is Athens. You can see it's like the southeastern area right here. And then you have the Peloponnesus, which is actually a peninsula right here. It looks like an island kind of, but it's connected. So it's technically a peninsula. That's where Sparta was at. If you ever heard of the movie The 300, then that's where they were from, was from the Peloponnesus, and they were from Sparta there. Thessaloniki is up here, and it's a famous port, and it's named after Alexander the Great's sister, actually. Macedonia is this disputed area up here. You can see Macedonia, FYROM. I think it's like former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia. I forget exactly off the top of my head. I had to look it up. But this area up north is where Alexander the Great was from. It's where Aristotle, the great philosopher, was born. And but now it's this disputed territory with all sorts of surrounding nations. You have the island of Crete down here, which basically means Great Island. And that's a pretty fascinating place as well. And with Greece, again, there's so much we could talk about. We will next year in world history, but for now I can't really say much more. But I will say that they are not Roman Catholic for the most part. Italy definitely is Roman Catholic. Spain definitely is. Portugal is. But you have what's called Greek Orthodoxy over here. Let me explain that real quick as we wrap this whole thing up. Oh, went too far. So Greek Orthodoxy is part of what's called Eastern Orthodoxy. And you probably maybe have never even heard of Eastern Orthodoxy, but you've probably heard of Roman Catholicism. But Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism split in the year 1054 AD. It was called the Great Schism. And basically you had the cities of Antioch, which is in modern Turkey, Asia Minor. You have Jerusalem. You had Constantinople at the time, which is now Istanbul. And Alexandria, Egypt. All were on the side of Eastern Orthodoxy, and then Rome in Italy became Roman Catholicism. It had started before that, but that's when the split was made official. So Roman Catholics centered around Italy and Rome and went westward. And then you had the Eastern Orthodox Church in the cities I just mentioned. And arguably the center of power for it these days is Moscow, Russia. But what about the differences? There's a lot of similarities between Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism. For example, they both believe in 7 sacraments. They call them mysteries from the Greek mysterion in the East, but they believe that there's 7 of these very special things the church does. Protestants typically only believe in 2, and that's baptism and communion, whereas the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church adds 5 to the list. They both feel kind of similar. You have a lot of the priests saying, "The Lord be with you," and the people responding, "And also with you," and with your spirit. And there's a lot of that back and forth. You have a lot of stand-up, sit-down, a lot of ritual in both traditions. But there's some big differences as well, though. Number one, the Orthodox Church doesn't have a pope, and they don't follow the pope, certainly not. That's one of the big reasons they split. The Catholic Church all believes that the Pope is the vicar of Christ, and he's a very high figure. The Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't have a Pope, but rather they meet together. They have a de facto leader, I guess you could say, the Patriarch of Moscow, and the Patriarch, he doesn't exercise authority like the Pope does by any means, but he gathers together bishops and archbishops, and they'll discuss and they'll work together as as not even a denomination, as a church, I guess you could say. But ultimately they have autocephalous churches that unite voluntarily under the umbrella of Eastern Orthodoxy. Theological differences, there are a few of them for sure. Like the Catholic Church believes in purgatory, the Orthodox Church doesn't. Actually, the Roman Catholic Church, I don't know if it's going to look backwards on my computer, but if you ever go to a Catholic church, they cross themselves like this. They start with the left shoulder. The Orthodox Church, they hold their hand like this. You put your thumb, your index, and your middle fingers together. This represents the Trinity. And the last two fingers represent the dual nature of Christ, being fully God and fully man. And the Orthodox Church crosses themselves from the right shoulder to the left shoulder. So the Catholic Church just holds their hand like this. Usually they go forehead, left, right. Orthodoxy, they do that what I just showed you, and they go from forehead, right to left. And the idea being, Christ is at the right hand of God. So you go the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the Orthodox Church is, well, we're going to go from the Father to the Son to the Holy Spirit. The Catholic Church argues, well, but if you're looking at the throne, then Jesus is seated on the right, but that's on your left. That's why they cross themselves on the left, is because they believe that that's actually God's right hand, because they're looking at God. So whatever, they can argue all they want about that. Another difference too is, if you ever pray the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed says, and talks about the Holy Spirit, right? It says, who proceeds from the Father and from the Son. That's what we normally say. The Orthodox Church does not agree with the wording there. They say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Catholic Church in the West, they added the phrase "and from the Son." That's called the Filioque clause. They added that after there was already agreement on keeping it differently. So there's a few minor issues like that they disagree on, but ultimately they feel and look pretty similar, and they do have a lot in common, but there are some definite differences. And here's the general spread of the Eastern Orthodox Church. You can see that it's pretty heavy in Russia. You can see here in south of Russia. You have Greece and some of the Balkans, and there's in Egypt over here, and then Australia. Then you actually have a decent amount in the United States and Canada as well. But that's Eastern Orthodoxy. It's a tradition that's arguably spans the early church and has over 300 million adherents. So it's definitely worth knowing. Okay, this week. So good job, you guys got the lecture. We're going to be, I'm going to have you guys do the Mediterranean map activity, and just as a chance to practice the geography. Watch CNN 10 and leave a comment, and work on your assessments. Everything's due Friday, 3 p.m. I didn't write that on here, but it'll be on your list. Everything's due Friday at 3 p.m. I recommend you get started on your assessment sooner rather than later. Let me know if you have any questions. Love you guys, and I'll talk to you later.